Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, May 11th, 2023. Just hours to go before Title 42 authority expires that had denied migrants trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border entry into the U.S. on the premise of preventing the spread of COVID-19. And when it does expire, at least 10,000 migrants per day expected to try to cross. Today, the U.S. House passing a Republican-drafted immigration and border security bill, almost all along party lines. And Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas with a briefing saying the Biden administration is ready and has been preparing for this moment for some time. Also today, congressional leaders of both parties reacting to 2024 Republican presidential candidate and former President Donald Trump's town hall meeting on Wednesday night, in which he suggested the U.S. could default on its debt without serious consequences, and he repeated the lies that he won the 2020 presidential election. House passing a bill today with the goal of recovering tens, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars of pandemic emergency unemployment insurance benefits that were fraudulently obtained. Environmental Protection Agency proposing a rule requiring existing power plants severely cut their greenhouse gas emissions or shut down. We'll talk about it with Washington Post climate correspondent Tim Pucco. And senators questioning Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin about why the Pentagon is not providing intelligence it has of Russian war crimes in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court to help in the prosecution. Now to immigration and border security. The bill passing the U.S. House of Representatives today, Washington Post writes, House Republicans timed the bill's passage to coincide with the rollback of a Trump-era policy that allowed U.S. Customs and Border Protection to use the coronavirus pandemic public health emergency as the basis to quickly deport undocumented migrants trying to enter the United States through the southern border. The Title 42 policy, as it is often known, ends Thursday, and agents are preparing for an influx of migrants following weeks of an unprecedented surge that has already strained Border Patrol stations and holding facilities. C-SPAN spoke with CQ Roll Call immigration reporter Suzanne Moniak about what's in the House bill and some last-minute changes made to secure the votes needed for passage.
It would restart border wall construction. It would reinstate migrant family detention. It would put more money and personnel toward the border and border security technology. Would also mandate employers to verify electronically that their employees have authorization to work in the country, heighten penalties for visa overstays, and other provisions aimed at increasing immigration enforcement.
It seemed to have hit a snag yesterday because it didn't have enough support. Who were the holdouts and what did they want added? Were they successful?
There were two issues that had caused some disagreement internally within Republicans yesterday ahead of the vote on the rule to move forward to debate today. One of those issues was related to provisions designating foreign cartels as terrorist organizations. That was something that was very important to Texas Republican Tony Gonzalez, and he wanted to see stronger language there. But other Republicans were concerned that this language might actually make it easier for migrants fleeing cartel violence to qualify for asylum. Another provision that had caused problems with Republicans from agricultural districts was the one requiring electronic verification of work authorization through a system known as E-Verify. They were concerned that this would essentially decimate the agricultural industry, which relies very heavily on migrant workers who are undocumented. And so what we had there were those two issues, and leadership met for hours in the afternoon with members who had the concerns. And ultimately they were resolved. The language on foreign cartels was weakened slightly, as Tony Gonzalez, he described it as having been watered down. And the language on E-Verify, while they did not officially shield at the agricultural industry from the provisions as was initially discussed, they did offer non-binding language showing that Congress, would consider, or that the Biden administration, I should say, would consider the effect of the E-Verify mandate on the agricultural industry if the bill were to become law.
Suzanne Moniak, immigration and Homeland Security reporter for CQ Roll Call, joining C-SPAN on this morning's Washington Journal. The House debated multiple hours on this immigration and border security bill, starting Wednesday night and then finishing Thursday afternoon. Here's some of that debate today. Congresswoman Laurel Lee, Republican from Florida, in support, followed by an opponent, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, Democrat from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, which is the most comprehensive border bill to reach the House floor in modern history. The Biden administration's border policies have led to a national security and humanitarian crisis at our southern border, turning every community into a border community. This administration's failure to secure the border has led to a record amount of illegal drugs both around the border and in our communities, and has enabled human trafficking and the exploitation of children. Recently, law enforcement in my community announced that they had seized enough fentanyl to kill every Floridian. In addition to the drugs flowing into our communities, we've seen a tragic flow of unaccompanied minors across our border, which has led many of them to fall victim to human trafficking, abuse, and mistreatment. A grand jury in Florida recently uncovered alarming details about federal agencies losing track of more than 20,000 children and failing to perform background checks on minor sponsors, again leading to incidents of trafficking, exploitation, and abuse. An open border is not humanitarian. When we fail to control our borders, the drug cartels will. House Republicans know that border security is national security, and that is why we must pass the Secure the Border Act. This legislation will increase the number of Border Patrol agents, strengthen current law to protect unaccompanied children, and bolster our border's infrastructure. We have a constitutional duty to secure our border and to ensure our communities back home are kept safe. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from the state of Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 2, a shameful, unserious bill that would shutter our country's asylum system and make the situation at the border much worse. For decades, congressional Republicans have blocked efforts to reform outdated immigration laws, choosing to focus only on the border, believing that if we can be cruel enough, that would deter desperate people from seeking asylum at our nation's front door. That hasn't worked, and H.R. 2 is more of their same failed approach. We all want an orderly, well-managed border, especially those of us who live and raise our families on the border. But there's a critical difference that exists from there. Many of my Republican colleagues want no immigration at all, and many believe cruelty is an effective deterrent. But my Democratic colleagues and I, and indeed most Americans, know that we must and should have legal pathways coupled with enforcement and strategic investment in order to achieve a functional system. This bill is an extremist Republican wish list that caters to the party's most warped values by jailing children and families and extinguishing asylum. The cruelty, unfortunately, is the point. It's no wonder that this bill has been called unchristian. I represent El Paso, Texas. I'm a proud third-generation El Pasoan, and it's where I raised my 2 children. My community has been at the forefront of immigration for decades, and El Pasoans have always stepped up to help migrants. Our local governments and NGOs work alongside U.S. Customs and Border Protection to provide migrants with food, a place to sleep, and assistance finding transportation to their next destination. We collaborate the best we can, united in our shared humanity. In 2019, for the first time, local partners became eligible to receive federal funding for this work, and that's been critical to El Paso and other border communities. H.R. 2 will bring that funding to an end and would make it illegal for NGOs to provide any services, from a bottle of water to a safe place to sleep. Let me remind you of Matthew 35:36, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. This bill would decimate the systems that border communities have built and would literally, by design, create humanitarian catastrophe. Because of this and many other shameful provisions, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand against this bill and work with those of us who are committed to a real bipartisan solution. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, Democrat from Texas. Before that, Congresswoman Laurel Lee, Republican from Florida, today on the House floor. The House went on to pass this immigration and border security bill by a vote of 219 to 213. Almost entirely party line, all the no votes coming from Democrats and 2 Republicans, Tom Massey of Kentucky and John Duarte of California. Congressman Duarte tweeting, amidst a humanitarian crisis on our border, we need solutions, not messaging. I call upon my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to work together on a practical fix to our broken immigration system. And Congressman Massey tweeting, fact, National E-Verify assumes every American is an illegal immigrant unless they identify their identity can be matched to a government database. I will vote against it today. But 219 Republicans voting yes. So the bill now heads to the Senate, but like many controversial bills passed this year by the Republican-controlled House, it may not be debated or voted on by the Democratically controlled Senate, and President Biden has said he would veto this bill if presented to him. An update from the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas today at the White House news conference about the expiration of Title 42 and what's next at the border.
Tonight at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, the pandemic-era Title 42 public health order will end. Starting at midnight, people who arrive at our southern border will be subject to our immigration enforcement authorities under Title 8 of the United States Code. Here is what that means. If anyone arrives at our southern border after midnight tonight, they will be presumed ineligible for asylum and subject to steeper consequences for unlawful entry, including a minimum 5-year ban on re-entry and potential criminal prosecution. The transition to Title 8 processing will be swift and immediate. We have surged 24,000 Border Patrol agents and officers, thousands of troops, contractors, and over 1,000 asylum officers and judges to see this through. We are clear-eyed about the challenges we are likely to face in the days and weeks ahead, and we are ready to meet them. We expected to see large numbers of encounters initially. We are already seeing high numbers of encounters in certain sectors. This places an incredible strain on our personnel, our facilities, and our communities with whom we partner closely. We prepared for this moment for almost 2 years, and our plan will deliver results. It will take time for those results to be fully realized, and it is essential that we all take this into account.
The Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas today in the White House briefing room. Fox News reports that Border Patrol agents made 10,000 migrant apprehensions Wednesday, the third day in a row to surpass that threshold as border crossings continue to surge ahead of the end of Title 42. CPB sources told Fox News. This week has seen the highest daily totals ever recorded for Border Patrol. Monday and Tuesday also saw historic numbers of over 10,000 a day. Currently, Customs and Border Protection has approximately 26,000 migrants in federal custody. Capacity across the southern border is about 19,000, and multiple sectors are well over capacity right now. That from Fox News. Back to the Homeland Security Secretary. Reporter asking about a Border Patrol memo that says that some migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border could be released into the United States without an ability to track them.
On the memo that the U.S. Border Patrol chief sent to sector chiefs last night allowing for parole releases if overcrowding becomes an issue, that's not Title 8 like you said would happen. I mean, these migrants don't get an alien registration number that would be used to track them. They don't get a court date. They're instead asked to self-report to ICE within 60 days. You said at the beginning that you've prepared for this moment for almost 2 years. So why is part of that plan an honor system?
Oh, it is not an honor system. What we do is we use the resources that we have to meet the challenges that we confront. This is a tool that has been used in the past. The vast majority of individuals will indeed be placed in expedited removal, and that if they do not qualify, will be removed in a matter of days, if not weeks, from the United States. When we encounter a volume of individuals for which we need to address in a different way, we do so. If those individuals do not honor their commitment to surrender to an immigration and customs enforcement officer to be able to be placed in enforcement proceedings, they are a subject of our apprehension efforts.
You said that it would be a fraction of migrants that this happens with. How many is a fraction when you've had almost 6 million illegal crossings under this administration?
We, last year, removed, returned, and expelled approximately 1.4 million individuals. That is the most in any one year.
Will you be on shaky legal ground, though, with mass releases?
Well, first of all, your question has a factual predicate with which I would disagree about mass releases, number one. But releases of individuals subject to immigration enforcement proceedings is not something particular to this administration.
It's on a case-by-case basis, and this would not be on a case-by-case basis.
We implement our operations in conjunction with the Department of Justice, and we have confidence in the lawfulness of our actions.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas today in the White House briefing room. Article from NBC News, the Biden administration began releasing migrants without court dates to alleviate overcrowding in March 2021, but had previously enrolled these migrants in a program known as Alternatives to Detention, which required them to check in on a mobile app until they were eventually given a court date. The new policy would release them on parole with a notice to report to an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office, but without enrolling them in that program. The U.S. public health emergency is expiring tonight as well. It's been renewed 13 times since the Trump administration first issued the declaration January 31st, 2020, when there were just 6 known cases of COVID-19 and no known deaths in the United States. Since then, in the 3 years, COVID has killed more than 1.1 million people in the United States, hospitalized millions more. The U.S. House of Representatives passing a bill today titled Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which would give states incentives to recover fraudulent unemployment benefit payments made during the COVID-19 pandemic. On the House floor, here's Congressman Jason Smith, Republican from Missouri, chair of the Ways and Means Committee.
This crucial legislation will finally protect taxpayers and victims of fraud against the largest theft of tax dollars in American history. Americans are suffering under a cost of living crisis fueled by Democrats' reckless spending. It has brought us to the brink of recession and spurred the highest increase in interest rates in 16 years. It must be infuriating for folks to also see that it's not just the American dream that's being stolen from them, but their identities and their tax dollars. Criminal organizations and foreign fraudsters exploited the pandemic to steal hundreds of billions in payments intended to keep workers afloat amidst government lockdowns, and the victims, they need our help. How much has been stolen? The Department of Labor Inspector General told the Ways and Means Committee that taxpayers may be on the hook for at least $191 billion in improper payments. And that's just the lower estimate. Outside experts estimate up to $400 billion of improper payments. While working Americans were trying to piece their lives back together during the pandemic, Democrats did nothing to fight fraud. When Democrats held the majority on Ways and Means, they ignored, they blocked, and shot down common sense safeguards and refused to hold even one hearing on this fraud. That inaction made it clear that their soft on crime agenda does not just apply to carjackings and looting department stores. It applies to defrauding the federal government as well.
Congressman Jason Smith, Republican from Missouri, today on the House floor. President Biden has issued a veto threat on this bill, writing, contrary to its stated purpose, the bill would strip state unemployment insurance programs of essential resources to fight fraud, combat identity theft, and recover overpayments, and would set back the goals of strengthening program integrity and combating systemic fraud. The bill would stop work on the modernization of antiquated UI systems in states across the country, undermining efforts to detect and deter fraud and improve identity verification and cybersecurity while ensuring timely, equitable, and accurate delivery of benefits to eligible workers. Part of the statement of administration policy and a veto threat from President Biden on this bill. Back to the House floor, Congressman Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas, opposed.
After President Trump twiddled while thousands of Americans died of COVID, we entered a national crisis. And in that emergency, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the states did not do enough to prevent fraud in this and other programs. If Republicans were genuinely interested in strengthening anti-fraud efforts, as I certainly am, we could today approve bipartisan legislation to do that. Instead, they reject many of the important recommendations that their own witnesses before our committee from the Government Accountability Office and the Inspector General told us were necessary. Instead of protecting taxpayers today from fraud, they use this misnamed bill to actually cut the very funding that is required for anti-fraud and recovery of wrong payments. When millions of Texans found themselves out of a job, the Texas Workforce Commission was not ready to provide a lifeline. Even in the middle of the night, my neighbors could not get through to get the insurance to which they were entitled. Little wonder that the same state agency did a sorry job of preventing fraud. The vast majority of Texans who eventually received unemployment were entitled to it, unlike, apparently, an indicted member of the Republican caucus. Our unemployment insurance system should be strengthened, not undermined, as this very bill would do. I yield back.
Congressman Lloyd Doggett, Democrat from Texas, on the House floor. The House passed this bill by a vote of 230 to 200. It was mostly party line, 10 Democrats joining the Republicans in voting yes. Bill now heads to the Senate. Wall Street today, the Dow down 221, NASDAQ up 22, S&P down 7. Former President Donald Trump, who was also a 2024 Republican presidential candidate, writing on his social media platform Wednesday night, "Hope everyone enjoyed CNN tonight. The New Hampshire audience was amazing. Thank you." Donald Trump took part in an hour-long town hall meeting aired on CNN, which said the audience was made up of Republicans and undeclared voters who plan to vote in the Republican presidential primary. After, CNN wrote a fact-check article that includes this line: Donald Trump made many false and unsubstantiated claims about the 2020 election, violence on January 6, 2021, the economy, and his handling of records after leaving the White House. Today, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, was asked about the Donald Trump town hall meeting. And we note that the speaker was holding a news conference at an unrelated event. He was laying a wreath at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C.
With this event, I would be remiss if I didn't ask, why have you not put forth a select committee to investigate the 2020 riots? Do you plan to do so, especially given the more than $1 billion in damage and the likelihood of future riots? And my second question is, what was your reaction to the CNN town hall with former President Trump last night, where he said he would be fine with the country defaulting, denied that he lost the 2020 election, mocked E. Jean Carroll, and wouldn't say whether he'd support Ukraine, and call Putin a war criminal?
Well, let me take your two questions, and as we're talking about national law enforcement. The first one is we will investigate that through committees. We have committees that can do that in the process of making sure within the riots. With the town hall meeting, the one thing, as many of you know, as we sit here today, Title 42 is going to be lifted on the border. 11,000 people came across yesterday, set a new record. 4.5 million have come across since President Biden has taken office. When he's lifted the actions of the last administration and the administration before that. We've watched fentanyl rise, killing our youth, being the #1 killer of those between the ages of 18 and 45. We watched just in the month of February of this year, more people were caught on the terrorist watch list in 1 month than were caught in the entire 4 years of the last administration. Just as this President Biden would ignore the problems of the debt ceiling, of the border, this conference has not. We raised the debt ceiling, but also curbed the rise of inflation. We've watched the inflation Democrats spend $6 trillion and harm every single family. For those in uniform who come home and their paycheck does not go as far, but they still risk their lives because the inflation Democrats have brought it here. We believe there's a better way to do it, to bring common sense and responsibility to how our budget is raised. Also today, we will pass on the floor the strongest border security this country has ever seen. We are the most generous nation in the world. 1 million new Americans will be sworn in this year. Same thing as next year or not. We believe in legal immigration. We believe the strength of this nation is the rule of law. But when you break the rule of law, you break down society. We've watched it time and again when they wouldn't uphold the law and these liberal judges and liberal movements in Congress. We believe in changing all that. We will not ignore the tough issues that this country has. We will study them, we'll propose, and we'll give solutions, just as we will today.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy taking reporters' questions. The question was about the Donald Trump town hall meeting on CNN last night. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, tweeting today, "I enjoyed congratulating President Trump on his outstanding town hall and undefeated record against CNN. They had to air him telling the truth about the 2020 election was rigged and stolen. We laughed and laughed." Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Democrat from New York, with this tweet, "CNN should be ashamed of themselves. They have lost total control of this town hall to again be manipulated into platforming election disinformation, defenses of January 6th, and a public attack on a sexual abuse victim. The audience is cheering him and laughing at the host." That from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The host was reporter Caitlin Collins. A question today about Donald Trump's town hall to the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, at his news conference.
Thank you. I would like to go back to President Trump. In the context of what you heard last night at the CNN town hall, what in your mind would his potential return to power mean for the United States?
Well, it would be a very dangerous, devastating, and destructive thing if Donald Trump got anywhere close to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and Exhibit A for the trauma that the American people will experience if that were to happen, were his own words and performance at that so-called town hall meeting. The modern-day Republican Party is the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene, George Santos, and Donald Trump. That's the reality, folks. You can't make this stuff up. That's the reality.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York, the minority leader, at a news conference. Governor Jim Justice, Republican from West Virginia, who's running for Senate, tweeting Wednesday night, President Trump dominated the CNN town hall tonight. Make no mistake, President Trump will be a fighter for hardworking West Virginians. On the Senate floor today, the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, talking about what Donald Trump said last night about the debt limit.
And if anyone doubts the hard right is in control, all they have to do is watch last night's CNN town hall, where former President Donald Trump openly called on Republicans to, quote, do a default if they cannot enact their hard right agenda. Never mind that under Donald Trump's watch, Republicans agreed to avoid default 3 times without ever getting hung up about unrelated partisan priorities. And never mind that 25%, a quarter, of the national debt was actually accumulated while President Trump was in office. He is openly calling on his party to destroy the economy if they can't pass their radical agenda. By now, of course, it is old news that Donald Trump is about as qualified to run the country as a broken brick. But the danger here is he holds enormous sway over Speaker McCarthy and the hard right. If Donald Trump says that it's better for the U.S. to default than it is for Republicans to compromise, that unfortunately only makes default more likely. Donald Trump's demands for default would cause tens of millions of Americans to suffer. This isn't difficult. Can we all clearly and unmistakably take default off the table? Will Speaker McCarthy take default off the table? He is the only one of the 5 of us who met at the White House who has not answered that.
Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, the majority leader on the Senate floor. And the Associated Press with a story, President Joe Biden's follow-up meeting with congressional leaders on the debt limit that was scheduled for Friday has been postponed to next week, with staff-level talks making progress and expected to continue through the weekend, the White House and congressional aides said Thursday. The White House and staff would continue to hold discussions, and the delay was billed as a sign of positive exchanges between Republican lawmakers, Democratic counterparts, and President Biden. That from Associated Press. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Be up to date in the latest in publishing with Book TV's podcast About Books, with current nonfiction book releases, plus bestseller lists, as well as industry news and trends through insider interviews. You can find About Books on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. A headline at WashingtonPost.com, the U.S. is taking a giant step toward meeting its climate goal. And the subhead is Administration proposes toughest limits ever on gas and coal power plants as part of a broader effort to slash emissions driving climate change. Joining us now on the phone is the climate correspondent on that article, Tim Pucko. Thank you very much for being here. What are the details on this EPA proposed rule, and how does it fit into President Biden's climate goals?
Well, it's one of the most important things that Biden can do himself. Of course, we had the giant climate spending bill that Congress passed last year at the president's behest. But this is one of the things that he does through his own administration, through the EPA, going after emissions from power plants. Right now, the power sector is the second largest source of planet warming gases in the United States. Of course, all of that comes from pretty much gas-fired plants and coal-fired plants. So this rule will attempt over many, many years, it's a rather lengthy phase-in, attempt to force those plants to adopt better technology or cleaner or more efficient fuels, or in some cases just to close altogether to eliminate or drastically reduce those emissions.
You also write that this announcement comes after years of turmoil at the EPA over how to craft power plant standards that can survive the types of legal challenges that brought down the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. So how is this different than that?
Well, power plants have been a huge target, especially for Democratic administrations, because they're such a big source of emissions. But the Obama administration, when they tried to do this for the first time, took what many people thought was a novel interpretation of the law and a rather creative way to try to do these rules more efficiently. They created a system where power producers could comply based on what they did across their entire fleet. So not just technology or changes at one particular plant, at one power plant, but changes across the whole system. And what the Supreme Court ultimately ruled is that that's not what the law allows. The Clean Air Act has a long history of allowing the EPA, the federal government, states to enforce or require technological advancements or basically systems to clean up, to reduce emissions at each individual power unit. And so the Biden administration has made it very clear that they are trying to heed that rule. They are trying to stick to the old-fashioned interpretation of the Clean Air Act, one that the Supreme Court, even in throwing out those old rules, said was okay, that they can enforce technology or new systems at each individual power plant. And so this rule is all about reducing what each individual plant can emit, enforcing technological advancements and cleanup moves at each individual plant.
We're talking with Tim Pucko from the Washington Post. Any reaction yet to the proposed rule from the stakeholders, the environmental community, energy industry, members of Congress?
There's pretty widespread support for this. I'll contrast this to the Obama era, again, when there was really widespread opposition, especially from the power industry, some of the biggest power companies that are out there. But even those companies, the criticism is muted behind the scenes. We're hearing a lot of positive things. The administration, the Biden administration, gives them a lot of years to comply with this. There's a lot of flexibility built into the rule, the proposal. The administration has made a big case that they have put a lot of different options in there, a really phased-in timeline over, nothing really changing for like 7 to 9 years. And so that's got a lot of support from even some of the biggest companies. The environmental groups don't seem to have a problem with that. They understand that a lot of the changes that the administration is pushing for are so big, requires so much investment that it will take years to implement. And so there's kind of widespread support for doing this in this way. There is some opposition from the more usual suspects. Of course, the coal industry, this would be really problematic for them. So miners, coal-producing states, legislators, largely Republicans, but also Joe Manchin from coal and gas-producing states, and with a lot of the power plants that still rely on those fuels. That's where their opposition is coming from. It's not. That's in the grand scheme of things, even across industry. That's a relatively limited source of criticism. I mean, the environmental groups and these large utilities are the biggest stakeholders out there, and they're pretty much all supportive of this strategy.
And this is a proposed rule. What happens next? How long before it could actually become a full-blown regulation?
Well, we've got about 60 days of public comment. That's pretty standard. In past attempts like this, a lot of times it takes months, maybe more than 2 years to do this. The Biden administration is intent on doing this in less than a year. The EPA Administrator Michael Regan said earlier today to reporters that they want to have this done by late next spring. They are facing some very real political deadlines. If you wait too long, well, first of all, the president faces re-election next year. Donald Trump, the leading contender among Republicans, has made it clear that he is not a supporter of climate regulation. He tried to undo rules like these, did undo the Obama-era rules that were similar to these, and has pretty much pledged to do that again. Like I said, there are a lot of other Republicans who are against this, and if they get control through next year's elections and these rules aren't in place in time, they have a lot of different ways to try to overturn them, to undo them. Even if they get in place late next year, if there's a Republican Congress and then they have a Republican in the White House, there are ways that Congress can quickly just get the rules off the books. So Regan, the current EPA Administrator, Michael Regan, said today that they want to finish this by next spring. The implication is that before those deadlines would come into play. But like I said, that's a big challenge. These can be very complicated rules. There's going to be a lot of public comment. It would be very fast from the track record, the historic track record of rules like this, if they got it done by May or June of next year.
Timothy Pucco is a climate correspondent from the Washington Post. His stories at WashingtonPost.com and on Twitter at Tim Pucco. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
President Joe Biden talking about his environmental record today in the White House Rose Garden. One of the topics, the recent EPA decision to restrict the mining of gold and copper in Bristol Bay watershed in Alaska.
In this age of climate change, the fish runs at Bristol Bay are breaking records. It's a marvel. And, it really is when you think about it. At least I was worried about this 10 years ago. Alaska Native people have rallied and relied on this fishery for millennia. Today, Bristol Bay supplies nearly half of the world's wild sockeye salmon and supports 1,000 or 15,000 jobs, American jobs in fishing, processing, and tourism. The economic value is estimated to be $2.2 billion. This amazing thing about resources like this, if you take care of it, it can go on forever, but it's impossible to put an economic price on that. And the opposite is true as well. Once a resource like this is harmed or destroyed, it may be impossible to bring it back again. That's why decades ago, when mining companies made plans to create one of the largest open-pit gold and copper mines in North America, right near the headwaters of Bristol Bay, folks were alarmed, including me. That mine would have destroyed 100 miles of streams and nearly 3,000 acres of wetlands and open water that are critical to salmon breeding. And it would have created billions of tons of toxic and dangerous waste. All that waste would have been stored behind a massive dam in perpetuity, forever. But Bristol Bay is a region prone to earthquakes, which could destroy that dam. It gets tremendous amounts of rain and snow, which would cause toxic waste to pour over the sides of the dam. And if the dam failed, the waste would be poured into the headwaters of Bristol Bay, and that would be a true calamity. Other mines like this in other parts of America, which are built in much drier climates, where consequences of an engineering failure would not have been as severe, but not in Bristol Bay. So it was critical to determine whether this mine could be safely built in a way that guaranteed Bristol Bay would not be harmed. As the years went by, engineers and scientists worked on the problem, and it became clear that there was no way to do this safely. And the tribal leaders, commercial fishermen, hunters, anglers, environmental advocates worked together to protect this ecosystem. Ultimately, the matter went to the federal government. As a candidate for president, I promised you I would listen to the scientists and concluded a rigorous, fact-based review of all of it. And to the tribal leaders whose firsthand knowledge had been gathered over generations, and to the fishermen whose livelihood depended on the bay. And that's exactly what I did. In the end, we used our authority under the Clean Water Act to ban the disposal of mine waste in Bristol Bay watershed, period. That means the mine will not be built.
President Joe Biden today in the White House Rose Garden. On Capitol Hill, the Senate voting to repeal the Biden administration's new rule under the Endangered Species Act about the definition of habitat. The vote was 51 to 49. Voting yes, all Republicans, plus Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Independent Angus King of Maine. Republican Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming spoke on the Senate floor before that vote.
This resolution rescinds the Biden administration's 2022 rule that rolled back a common sense and necessary definition of habitat under the Endangered Species Act from the previous administration. When Congress passed the Endangered Species Act, it granted the Secretaries of Interior and Commerce, through the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Services, respectively, the authority to designate areas as critical habitat. Section 7 of the Act prohibits the destruction or adverse modification of these critical habitat designations. There is no doubt that habitat loss is a contributing factor to species decline. So protecting habitat that is necessary to the survival of species is appropriate. The problem that has arisen, however, is that these designations have on occasion been weaponized to the detriment of landowners, the American public, and the very species we are trying to protect. 2/3 of all endangered species are located on private lands. For these species to be recovered, private landowners must be part of the solution and not treated as the enemy. Unfortunately, through aggressive critical habitat designations, as well-intentioned as they might be, private landowners are penalized and harmed instead of incentivized to help with species recovery.
Senator Cynthia Lummis, Republican from Wyoming, today on the Senate floor before the Senate voted on her resolution, 51 to 49, passing it to reverse the Biden administration rule on habitat under the Endangered Species Act. This now goes to the Senate. President Biden says he would veto it if it passes the House as well, and a veto override does require a 2/3 vote of Congress. Today's Senate vote is short of that. This is Washington Today. From BBC News, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his country needs more time to launch a much-anticipated counteroffensive against Russian forces as the military awaits a delivery of promised aid. President Zelensky was interviewed for public service broadcasters who are members of Eurovision News.
Are you ready for this counteroffensive?
Mentally, we're ready. In terms of how motivated our military are, we're ready. In terms of enough personnel in our brigades, we're ready. In terms of equipment, not everything has arrived yet. That's my answer.
So you're still waiting for weapons and for the kind of military equipment that have been promised to arrive?
Yes, we're still expecting some things. They will reinforce our counteroffensive. And most importantly, they will protect our people. We're expecting armoured vehicles. They arrive in batches. We can advance with what we've got, and I think we can be successful. But we will lose a lot of people. I think that is unacceptable. We need to wait. We need a bit more time.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in an interview on Eurovision. In Washington, D.C., Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin testifying before Senate Appropriations Subcommittee, getting questions from Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, about why the Pentagon has not turned over evidence of alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. Secretary Austin telling Senator Durbin he's concerned the ICC may prosecute U.S. troops in the future. Senator Durbin begins by referring to a meeting he had with the ICC prosecutor.
When I met with Conrad Khan, I asked him if there was more the United States could do to help him gather the evidence and the documents necessary to prosecute Vladimir Putin for these awful war crimes. He said there was cooperation from the Department of State, the Department of Justice, but he did not include the Secretary of Defense in your department. Khan's efforts regarding war crimes are so important that Congress last year passed additional authority allowing the U.S. to share critical war crimes evidence and intelligence with the International Court of Criminal Justice. We have one president, we have one commander-in-chief, but I'm not certain that we have one policy when it comes to the war criminal Vladimir Putin. I'd like to ask you directly, why are you reluctant to share the evidence that we have gathered in the United States through the Department of Defense for those who are holding Vladimir Putin accountable for his war crimes?
Thank you, Senator. Up front, I absolutely agree with what you said in terms of the atrocities that we've witnessed throughout. It's been absolutely despicable, and we continue to see evidence of Putin deliberately targeting civilians, hospitals, and apartment buildings, and you name it. The department firmly supports the goal of holding Russia accountable for its violations in Ukraine. There are multiple ways to promote accountability, including the domestic Ukrainian efforts that you mentioned, and I believe that in a principled approach to promoting accountability. And I will always prioritize the protection of U.S. military personnel in anything that we do.
So why is your department not sharing evidence that we have gathered to help that effort? The Department of State is, the Department of Justice is. Why is the Department of Defense not doing so?
Senator, I will just tell you that it is important to us to make sure that that Russia is held accountable, and we support the goal of holding them accountable. But again, I do have concerns about reciprocity going forward, and so we will continue to look for ways to support the effort of holding Russia accountable.
Are you aware of the additional authorities we created by law that allow your department and the others of this government to cooperate with the ICC?
I am aware of the legislation, Senator.
Do you feel there is a deficiency in that legislation which holds you back from helping to prosecute Vladimir Putin?
I see no deficiencies in your legislation, no.
Then what is the explanation? There's got to be a bottom line here. Why is it when these prosecutors come and meet with us, they list the cooperating agencies of our government and specifically don't list the Department of Defense? Why?
Again, Senator, we'll do everything within our power to make sure that that we support efforts to hold Russia accountable. But again, I remain concerned about the protection of U.S. military personnel.
I've got to ask for more, General. I respect you, and I voted for you, and I'd do it again, but I've got to ask for more. Your personal feelings about whether you do it or not should be second to the law, should it not?
It is. They are, Senator.
Well, if the law says cooperate and you refuse, what conclusion am I supposed to draw?
Senator, we have not refused to abide by any law. So there could be some confusion here, but again, we support the goal of holding Russia accountable.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin answering questions from Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, at today's Appropriations Subcommittee hearing. Also testifying, General Mark Milley, Chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You can find the full hearing on our website, cspan.org. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin and another top Russian official, alleging the war crime of transporting Ukrainian children from Ukraine to Russia. It's a claim that Russia denies. Washington Post article out of Cape Town, South Africa. The United States believes South Africa loaded weapons and ammunition onto a Russian vessel docked at the country's main naval base in December. Washington's envoy to South Africa said on Thursday. U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigidi, told a press conference that the United States took the matter seriously and had raised concerns about arming Russia during recent diplomatic and trade discussions with a visiting South African delegation in Washington. More on this from the State Department spokesperson in Washington, Vedant Patel.
The Ambassador Brigidi today made allegations that Russia has delivered. Correct me if I'm wrong. He said that South Africa has delivered weapons to Russia. Maybe there's some more nuance to that. The South Africans, in turn, have said that they're disappointed that he went public with this. Could you explain a little bit more of the allegations about why the United States feels that this happened and the decision to go public? Will it affect the relationship with South Africa?
What I will say, Sean, is that we remain committed to our affirmative agenda of our bilateral relationship with South Africa, one that is focused on the priorities the two governments share, priorities that the recent high-level delegation to Washington discussed. These include issues of global peace and security, further growing the robust trade relationship, working together on a shared health agenda, finding ways in which we, the United States, can be helpful to South Africa's energy challenges through a just transition of renewable sources of energy, as well as continued partnerships on work as it relates to addressing climate change. That being said, Sean, as we have previously said, the U.S. Has serious concerns about the docking of a sanctioned Russian cargo vessel at a South African naval port in December of last year. And as good partners do, we have raised those concerns directly with multiple South African officials, and I will leave it at that.
State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel at his briefing today. Back to the Washington Post article, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa told Parliament on Thursday he was aware of the ambassador's remarks, but did not confirm or deny the claim. Later in a statement, the presidency expressed concern and called the ambassador's remarks disappointing, saying the ambassador's remarks undermine the spirit of cooperation and partnership that characterized the recent engagements between the U.S. government officials and a South African official delegation. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.